Out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of the filmmaker and photographer Ben Devenezia, who I'll probably butchered his surname slightly, but yes, I'll put a link in the notes below so you'll be able to find out how to really pronounce his name, who is a filmmaker who's working on a new indie documentary called Where the Kids Still Scream. It's going to be about the New York City punk and DIY scene, and he's launching a Kickstarter campaign to get bits and pieces before starting the film. I will put the links in the notes below so you can click on that to find out more about the project, but in the meantime you can listen to this fascinating interview to find out more about Ben and everything he's up to and has been up to. So anyway, after several minutes of interesting but casual chat, we get down to the exciting subject that was basically the early formative years and a little bit more about this very interesting project. Ben, it's over to you.
So I'm 27, and funny enough, where I live, I don't know why, but there's a massive building that has probably one of the biggest David Bowie murals painted on the side of it. As you come into my neighborhood in Hoboken, there's a really big David Bowie mural.
Right.
But my musical awakening was probably my dad was a big kind of music head, collected cassettes and CDs, and he introduced me to the Misfits, Nirvana, and that was, I think, kind of like the start of it, and even like AC/DC and more like rock. And then I went on my own like punk journey in the early 2000s with like Green Day, My Chemical Romance, and some of those more like pop punk bands. But I would say that was kind of my first love, was that genre of early punk, early 90s punk. I felt like it really influenced kind of who I was as a kid, being involved in like skate culture and all of that as well.
Yes, because that was the 90s was quite interesting, didn't it? Because it started with the grunge scene, but the album Nevermind by Nirvana, and then it kind of finishes on a bit of a sort of an interesting note, doesn't it? With Woodstock '99, doesn't it? It's sort of by the end of that decade, it's gone from kind of quite sophisticated, thoughtful music with lyrics that meant something to sort of these quite a different world, really, wasn't it? The decade ended on a bit of a sort of a riot, really. Did you ever see the movie? The Woodstock '99 film?
I have, yeah. It's incredible too. And I was just talking about this last night with a friend over dinner, just how it's funny there's like this feeling amongst me and my friends where we long for a period that we weren't even alive for, especially when it comes to music, where you were saying the lyrics used to mean something. We always talk about, like the political and cultural influence of punk music and just music in general, and how it used to comment on social issues and all these things. And now it seems like it's been diluted and softened. And we long to almost be back in that, like, we would love to be part of the 70s and 80s scene, where it was cultural revolution was everywhere and it was, exciting and cool. And now it's, I think that things have become so commodified, and it's difficult to find where like the actual true authenticity is in lyrics,
Yes, I guess it is interesting because I suppose, I look back on the 80s with huge fondness, obviously, because, there was a lot of bands I liked. But then I used to hark back to the 60s thinking, my God, that would have been amazing, or bits of the 70s. So I wonder if we all do that and then don't always appreciate what you've got until it's gone. Then you think, oh, actually, it was quite good. I don't know. I mean, it is, the 80s, when I was growing up, the 70s was kind of an embarrassing decade. People must have thought, God, the 60s were brilliant. They had all the best, everything, the music, the drugs, the scenes. The 70s was a disaster. And then a few decades later, the 70s become a bit cool. And they go, no, the 70s were great. You had the glam, you had even prog rock, which was a bit embarrassing. Then punk, you had disco. And all those worlds. But at the time, you thought, I'm sure people weren't enjoying the 70s. And in the way, the 80s was my decade. And when people reminisce about it, I often think, we just sat around moaning all the time, being a bit depressed. Yeah. But it was much more. Fair. I think music was quite tribal when I was growing up, and I think talking to all these people that I interview, we do talk about the tribal. You couldn't sort of dilute. You couldn't sort of go from one scene to another. You either had to be a new romantic or a goth. 24/7. You couldn't admit to liking two-tone or heavy metal. It was
Right.
it was like you would get beaten up, by the rockers of the time.
That's
The
fair.
70s rockers were quite hard, really. They were into black, not death metal, that hadn't been invented, heavy metal, I suppose. So
Yeah.
things like two-tone and mod, was looked upon as being really poncy. And, you must have been a bit odd and a bit queer, so.
No, it's very true. Like it's definitely like even now, like I think that all of the genres have started to blend. Pretty much since like 2010 probably was truly where I think that we stopped having hard lines on what these genres are, and it's interesting because then I think that the identity around music became more like commercialized in like in industry branding, and people began to associate more with brands and those types of commercialized things instead of like movements or music. And although maybe you can go from punk to hip hop and not get beat up, you still sorry are still you're still kind of like typecasted and forced into a specific identity within that.
Yes. Well, I think when you had things like the festivals of the 60s, like Woodstock or Altamont. No, not Altamont. That was when it went badly. Monterey and a few of the other ones. I think the people who went there were there for that kind of reason, to sort of be part of the counterculture hippie movement, to kick against the man and yes, bring down society, and just growing your hair long. Whereas I think Coachella doesn't seem to have that kind of ethos, from what I can see on social media. Whereas, and as I remember, there's a very famous DJ that sadly passed away called John Peel from the UK, and him, I remember him saying that festivals definitely changed when you could smell sort of people having, like washing and sort of aftershave and perfumes that you never had, in the 60s and 70s and even the 80s. It was just like you just didn't wash for 5 days, and you'd realise how much you stunk when you went to the petrol station, and then you went, oh my God, we really do smell. But it's like, well, we haven't washed for a week, so I'm not surprised. So
yeah. No, it's an interesting point too, because I'm a very big like surfer is a big like surfing is a big part of my life, and that's something too that through, I don't know if it was COVID or what, but the similar thing where you would start to be in these lineups and you would smell aftershave and cologne, and you'd be in like ocean and this beautiful nature, like kind of immersed into trying to like separate and just connect with something outside of yourself, and then all of a sudden you smell someone's a clone and you're like, that's not right. Why is that I should not be smelling this in the ocean right now.
Yes, I know. I mean, they didn't have such things as washing facilities. I think there was one probably slightly sort of dodgy cold tap that you just had to queue for ages to get any water. You didn't even dream of washing. You just memories of queuing for a little bit of cold water just to drink, really. So then how does that, because obviously 27 being quite a famous age in rock and roll, isn't it? So how do you then sort of progress from sort of school, college to your next project that you're sort of working on?
Wait, what do you mean?
Oh, well, this idea of wanting to document this, scene. How did your filmmaking develop? How did that what was the narrative of that?
Oh, so like, yeah, so I kind of fell into kind of documenting and filming weirdly because after college I got a job for a bank, and thought that I was going to be a banker for a while, and that was my goal in college. And then once I graduated, I graduated college over COVID, so my first job was online, and I found like the computer experience to be tumultuous, where I just sitting on a desk all day, not connecting with real people, just being on a screen. That I kind of was living in California, bought a camera just to have like a hobby, and I ended up going on renting a van and living in that van for a few weeks and going up and down the coast taking pictures. And I realized that like there was something quite incredible about the experience of just documenting my own life events. And then I decided to quit my job and backpack from California to Colombia. And there I was meeting a ton of people that I found to be fascinating, started to just record conversations and people and just like life and ways of life. And that then sparked this inspiration of like, okay, like I am not a banker. I'm wanting and hoping to be some form of a storyteller, and just wanting to connect with people and just kind of humanize the idea that we're all very similar despite your socioeconomic status or whatever it is where you live. And then that led me to move to New York and do music photography and videography, and I've used to work for record labels in Manhattan and then just went fully independent. And now I'm here trying to make this project happen, where it's my first fully independent thing I've done on my own. And, it's been an interesting path, but, yeah, I would say it's pretty non-traditional because I didn't study film or anything in college. I actually studied math.
Right.
And, yeah.
Yes. Well, I'm sure that has a good grounding for sort of dealing with situations and, yes, following instructions and understanding how to sort of solve issues and problems. So what bit of, because just give us an idea of your first project that you're crowdfunding for at the moment that you're sort of going to be hopefully making very soon.
Yeah, so we're slated to shoot May 2nd is our first interview with a cool band, very like an up and coming punk band in Brooklyn. But the project's called Where the Kids Still Scream, and it's essentially a journalistic approach to the DIY and punk scene in Manhattan. And the themes that we're trying to cover are how has the ethos shifted from basically like the 70s or the 80s and like this period of, like I would say that like people feel very nostalgic for when it comes to New York City punk, and how has that ethos changed? So we're having conversations with new bands and old bands just to understand kind of the motivations behind why they make music. And then another theme is the commercialization of punk and just the commodification of streaming music and everything. So once punk becomes commercially viable, is that a failure of the genre, or is that just a natural progression of what it means to be a band in 2025? And then we're trying to explore kind of the it's the sorry, I'm blanking on my words. It's the the dynamics, of indie record labels and social media platforms, and kind of playing with these like algorithmic things that kind of seem to influence our day-to-day decisions. Is that like a punk thing to do? And how does the new age people who are making this music, how do they interact with it? And is it possible to still be punk in 2025? And then lastly, can punk exist without a home? I think that CBGBs in Manhattan and some of these other major venues closing in the mid 2000s, I think that it's somewhat decentralized where punk had a voice. So then, it's kind of, there's a big online focus, I would say, because it's like, I was talking to one band as like a pre-meeting, and they were talking about how the way that they see the community is like everyone's their own island now, and it's like you can go to each other's islands and you share different things, but it's like, the idea that everyone operates as their own island, I think, is very different than what the inception of punk used to be in the 70s. So we're basically just trying to explore kind of the general ethos around the current genre and, from where it started.
Yes, well, it's interesting because if you go to Las Vegas, they have the punk museum that they have started there, which I don't know if they opened it last year, and that was quite interesting. It would be worth, I would say, he says just throwing ideas, and kind of interested to talk to those people because they come from a punk background, and so they, I've done interviews with them, when it opened last year, and even a member a couple of months ago actually, and about what they were trying to do and what they were trying to aim for, and their whole sort of dilemma of putting punk and all this kind of stuff, clothes, lyric sheets, kind of posters in a museum, because everything becomes kind of interesting how suddenly it becomes commodified, and when you get a price on it and there's some sort of monetary value, then suddenly it goes from going to the landfill or recycling into behind sort of a glass cabinet, and suddenly it's worth thousands, if not tens of thousands, and sometimes even more, because it's like, oh my God, that's Lemmy Kilmister from Motorhead's, hat and bass, and that's Joe Strummer's jacket, and so it's kind of
Yeah.
interesting how things. But I think everything happens like that, because when the '60s began, I remember watching documentaries, and people were like, oh, this isn't going to catch on at all, psychedelic music. But then, I think it was a member of the Grateful Dead who was saying that suddenly, you get these kind of record executives who couldn't understand anything about the current music scene, but could just see all these kids and go, my God, all they were looking at was dollar signs, and going, right, sign anybody, just sign the law. This is where it's at. We're going to make the money. And then obviously that generation then becomes kind of old fogyish, because when punk comes along, it's like, God, this isn't real music. The Damned, the Ramones, the Clash, the Sex Pistols, it's interesting how the establishment, who aren't even that old, but have got their nice jobs, and they're listening to, West Coast rock and the work of Crosby, Stills and Nash, and, the Eagles, the Ramones come along, and it's like, oh my God, should we just ban it? And then somebody says, no, actually, we could sell lots of units. And then it's like, okay, let's get into punk, let's get rid of some of these members as staff, because they don't obviously understand what music's about. So it's kind of, I think there's always a bit of a struggle when there's a new scene, but then, it happens. But then after 18 months, it then probably gets very diluted. And then, like with punk coming along, I remember quite quickly, the bands that obviously started jumping on the bandwagon just sound like, well, these aren't really punk. They just look a bit odd, They kind of got the attitude. They haven't got the attitude. They got some of the clothes, but they don't really make that sort of original sound. So it's kind of interesting how scenes sort of get diluted very quickly. I don't know if you've ever seen a film. There's a film called With Nell and I, and it was about these two actors in London who were unemployed, and they had this drug dealer called Danny appears, and then he's talking about they're set in the 60s. It's a bit of an autobiographical film. It's worth watching. It's very British, by the way, but there's a brilliant bit with Jimi Hendrix, Purple Haze All Along the Watchtower. But then there's the drug dealer who says, oh man, the 60s are over. They're selling hippie wigs in Woolworths, and you're just thinking, suddenly people start going to dressing up, like fancy dress parties, wearing as hippies or as punk, and you think, I think it's kind of over now. It's safely, we can say it's died, the dead.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
It is very interesting, and how we phrase it in the documentary is like the verbiage that we use has the aesthetics of punk outpace the music, and it's very similar to what you're describing, where it's is it more about this like brand identity where like maybe you wear an excessive amount of black, or like I think that growing up like in 2010 it was all about the studded belts, and there was an aesthetic to the genre, and that was all good and fun when the music still meant something. But then if the aesthetics outpaces the messaging of the music, does that dilute its role in society, or its importance, or just does it mean that like you can still carry the message of what the music used to mean?
Yes.
But it's very interesting. I don't mind the British too. I don't know if I told you I grew up in England.
Oh right.
Do have you been to Newcastle?
No, I have to confess, I have not been to Newcastle. But
no, the Northeast is a cold and dark place.
But I know there was certain clubs, especially in the 80s, they've now got a blue plaque saying this. There was an indie club here, and there was an indie club there, or punk club. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of interesting how that kind of happened. So you grew up in Newcastle, which was, I think, the home of the Animals, and Charles Chandler, who was the bass player, who then signed Jimi Hendrix. So there was a sort of an interesting Jimi Hendrix connection there. And, yes.
And my town. Oh wait. I'm gonna blank on the name now. The town I grew up in, Whitley Bay. There's a famous guitar player that I'm completely blanking on who grew up in his autobiography, wrote about the place called Spanish City, which is in Whitley Bay. But I guess it's a moot point because I can't remember the guitar player's name.
So was the book called Spanish City?
No. The place in Whitley Bay is called Spanish City. And he writes about that, like growing up in that area, because he used to be a little bit rough with old slot machines and.
Yes, I'm just googling Whitney Bay. Famous guitarist, is it?
Yeah, let me see if I can find it.
Oh, no, I'm not coming up with anybody here at the moment.
Um, sorry, I'll I'll have to I'll message you with who I'm trying to remember who it was. But
John
yeah,
McLaughlin. No, it's not him, is it? He's quite
no, it's oh my goodness. I shouldn't have brought this up without
No,
knowing
this is
his name.
well, it's a great conversation. No, it's okay. But the interesting thing, going back to the kind of the music and the message and stuff like that, I think when there was those periods in music where there was a lot of anger, it kind of is also mirrored with the political scene at the time. So in the 70s in the UK, there was a lot of high unemployment. You know, the 3-day week. You know, there was, you know, electricity had to be cut for several hours a day because there wasn't enough. So you had to have dark. I do remember sort of suddenly the electricity would go off for about 3 hours and you'd all sit around, you know, in with candles on the table, just sort of staring at, you know, nothing really. I mean, it was kind of interesting, but there was that kind of movement of like young people getting really annoyed because, you know, it was Yes, Genesis, you know, this very classical pop stuff, which we refer to as, you know, prog rock, which didn't really, you know, it sung about beautiful things and fantasy lands, which is hard when you're sort of a 15-year-old kid who's got no sort of financial sort of help or sort of much sort of positivity or much future. So that's where a lot of people get angry. And it was interesting with that Woodstock 99 when I was watching that documentary, people analysing it, saying, well, the 90s was quite a cushy period for a lot of kids. And actually they didn't have much to rebel against. And then it becomes this very hedonistic period. And everyone's just, you know, goes a bit wild, but there's no depth. You know, this is a bit of a sweeping statement, you know, but, you know, there wasn't that much to get angry about. There wasn't the Vietnam War that they had in the 60s and the 70s, or Nixon and Watergate and stuff like that. So perhaps when there is a political period where things are sort of difficult and people get very angry and desperate, you know, sometimes the artwork reflects that, and perhaps the music scene for the next 4 years might be quite different with the current state of affairs.
No, definitely, and that's also a major theme is like punk and politicization. I mean, you said it perfectly, and the concept of a cushy time too. Like, you know, I think that like people, you know, sometimes I'll listen to podcasts or read books, and they discuss like the death of music in 2010, and you know, I think that like you could call it a general softening of society, and everything became quite comfortable, especially in America. You know, like the amount of convenience that we have. You know, I don't know like the how prevalent Uber Eats and all of these delivery services are in England right now, but you know, where I live, I don't know a single person who like gets their own groceries or goes and buys their own food. Everything's delivered, and it's interesting now because we're in a period where everything is so politicized, and then we're all having these heavy conversations about how bad things are, but at the same time, you know, people are living in very nice apartments and getting food delivered to them by by people on bicycles, and I think that what will happen through this current administration, avoiding any like political alignment, is I think that very good music will come out of it. I was just talking to a band, and she was saying, you know, she's excited for the punk music that's going to come out in the next 4 years, although, you know, that might be on the on the tail of you know, some pretty potentially bad events for the country. But there's a big component of the politicization in punk. But at the same time now, everything seems to be politicized in the U.S., whether it be media, TV shows, and, you know, specific brands just aligning with political movements. So is the importance of punk being political still relevant with today's social dynamics? You know, and I think that that's a hard question to answer, but I think that it's an interesting point, especially in a place like New York, where, you know, there's a ton of industry, and people, you know, you'll see someone who lives in a $10 million high rise next to someone who's asleep on the subway. And, you know, it's a very interesting conversation to have, I think, in Manhattan.
Yes. Well, there was always like academic lecturers, you know, who on their subject would be doing sort of books and sort of weekend kind of conferences about sort of can music influence politics, and can you get people to sort of vote in a certain way, which, you know, was one of those great topics, because in the 80s they had rock against racism, but they also had some sort of very minor movement, which at the time I thought was big, but it wasn't really, called Red Wedge, where they had this, there was Paul Weller who was in the Jam, and various other people, a gang of them, about 20 odd musicians and bands, touring the country, the UK during the 80s to try and get the young people to vote, and with the idea that they'd vote Labour and then they would get the Conservative government out. And, this was a great movement. And for a heady, very short period of time, it's like, oh, this could be absolutely amazing. But then the next election came along and there was some bigger landslide than ever. And then in the latest American election, you had all the musicians from Bruce Springsteen to Taylor Swift to Billie Eilish all sort of saying who they were going to vote for and encouraging people. And you thought, well, that's kind of interesting. I wonder, because what I'd been mentioning in the UK was quite really quite niche, but at the time you think it's quite big, but it was really niche. Whereas in the US, you think, oh, these are massive artists who sell millions of albums. Perhaps they will have an influence, and then obviously didn't quite work to plan. So it's kind of interesting those, how far can pop and rock and punk music change people's kind of the political landscape, really. And
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but my general understanding even is like skinheads for a short period of time were a positive liberal movement in England before it was somewhat co-opted by neo-Nazis. And it's an interesting part of history that the like almost the punk scene in England, if you can call it punk then, was, skinheads, which were about equality. And, then the aesthetic of being a skinhead was taken then by this like very damaging, social rhetoric, being a Nazi and it being more about, like protectionism. It's interesting how these potentially positive movements can be co-opted and politicized and you can completely change the messaging in a short period of time. And I think that punk kind of goes through that a lot.
Yes, I think, that did. I mean, I don't really know that much about the skinhead movement, but it doesn't stop you having an opinion, though, does it? But yes, I think it kind of started. I think it started with a lot of the music. People really liked that kind of ska. It was kind of connected to the ska movement, and obviously that was mostly from Jamaica, I believe. And then kind of from there, it sort of gets this kind of a few swastikas, and sort of people started doing the Sikh Highland, and then there was a few bands who did align themselves very much with the right, and as you mentioned, protectionism and this kind of idea of sort of protecting the island, and sort of glorifying the armed forces that keeps us free and stuff like that. And it starts to merge, and it starts to get a little bit sort of a little bit tense, because you sort of feel like, actually, I'm not sure if this is such a great way to go forward. And there's a lot of hatred and anger and aggression that starts to develop, which for some soft little liberal like me, I find it a bit upsetting and a bit worrying. So
definitely.
So I sort of quickly, and also the punk movement started with this kind of idea that, about individuals and sort of, like X-Ray Specs and people like Polystyrene, who, just dressed up in very colourful clothes. And then suddenly you got the Sid Vicious character, and then you get the Sid Vicious kind of followers, and then punk becomes spiky hair and, the black leather jacket and, the belt and all that. And it's like, I'm not sure. And I spoke to a few punk people in punk bands, and they just would like, oh my God, look at that audience. That's not what we got into punk for, just to make you all look the same. And, it's very aggressive. It becomes quite macho. And then quite a few of those bands like, I think we're going to be out of this now, because that's not what we wanted punk to be. So it kind of, every scene I think has potentially 18 good months, and then it's like, oh dear, then it gets pretty awful, and then it's then another scene.
Yeah, oh sorry. But it just becomes like a broader theme, I think, in music. And then anyone who has a platform is, like you said, like you have a period where your messaging is in line with all these people, and but then I think that the part that then when you cross that barrier almost into calling it mainstream is like you no longer can choose who your audience is, which I think is both beautiful and can be potentially bad. Is that when you can't choose who your audience is, you don't know then how they're going to continue carrying the ethos forward with the initial inception of whatever your messaging is. And you kind of either have to like accept that and just keep going with your own like authentic narrative, or I think what happens more so is you no longer tell people what is cool. They begin to tell you what is cool, and you become a band or an image that is like a, too many cooks in the kitchen, for lack of a better word, with that. And then, I think that's also what happened with record labels. Is there used to be positions where you would hire a cool person, like you know what I mean? Like you get paid to be the cool person who finds cool stuff, and you would tell people what is cool, and you would kind of fight for the idea of indie or DIY. And then all of a sudden, when there was so much money to be made by the masses started to tell you what was cool, and that dilutes your own social messaging.
Yes. Well, I think with those record labels in the 80s, as an example, so, there was an indie scene which was different, the indie charts, which were different to the mainstream charts. And those labels like Rough Trade, 4AD, Creation Records, Glass Records, you almost just didn't worry. You didn't have to worry too much about buying the album by such a band, because you knew the person who was curating that label would have picked it for a certain reason, so you took a pretty good sort of bet that you'd buy it and think, yeah, this is going to be okay because it's on 4AD, and I'm sure the person who's signed the band and has been part of producing that album and nurturing that band will have sort of done something quite good. Whereas with a bigger label like Warner's or sort of Elektra Music or Island Music or Virgin, you have no idea because you don't know what the band and the sound they're going for. There was a particular identity, I think, especially in the certain decades, in the 80s as an example. There's a lot of identity with like, oh yes, I like bands who are on. There was another label called Sarah Records, which was tiny, but again, they become such a cult status because I think the two people who ran Sarah Records just wanted a particular sound that sort of fitted in with what they liked. And actually, they were the people who ran it, who actually they wanted to like the music they put out. They didn't worry about sort of whether they sold many copies. It's like, well, this is the music that we'll listen to when we get home, and we just happen to be running the record label. And obviously, these things don't last for long because eventually they think, actually, we still can't afford to live. So,
Exactly.
we're going to have to eventually yes, knock it on the head. And also, I think with, doing these interviews, I noticed that most bands have the 3 to 5 year narrative in the 80s, I suppose. They get together, they'd have their 12-month honeymoon period of making a sound, they get a single. And we had, there would be certain gatekeepers, like DJs or music papers. There was John Peel, Janice Long in the UK, and music papers like the NME Sounds Melody Maker. So they would have that access to sort of a little bit of exposure. And then, as you might gather from the UK, it's a tiny country, but every city would have an alternative indie club. So they could get their little transit van and trundle around the country and play all these little venues around the place in front of 150 to 200 people, which would be fine when you're 18, having that lifestyle. It was very exciting. And they got the album, potentially a second album, but by the third album, they just absolutely hated each other and had no money either. But they made 2 or 3 fantastic albums that us punters would love intensely. So yes, for the artists though, they suffered for decades, traumatized by the experience.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting feature kind of along the documentary is what I think the modern version of that is like streaming platforms and their predictive algorithms the people are being pigeonholed now more than ever, where it's if you have Spotify or Apple Music or any of these, but it's incredibly difficult to find new music on Spotify. And my roommate says it so poignantly, where he's like, whenever I go on a suggested radio from Spotify, he's like, it's just the songs that I intentionally didn't have on my playlist. Like, they're not pushing you to discover new music. They're trying to curate it. So it's like you are always hearing what you've already heard. And what's coming now is like a lot of these Instagram and TikTok pages are music curators, where they're people who, are tastemakers, similar to how the industry labels used to function. And they just tell people what they like. And they get massive amounts of interactions because it's like, finally, here's someone who's promoting a band that maybe only has 2,000 monthly listeners, but their music is amazing. And you otherwise wouldn't have heard from them because of the, industry influence and streaming algorithms. And I think that's like still one of the beautiful parts of social media. And, it's hard sometimes to find anything good to say about social media nowadays, you know?
Yes, yes. No, it's interesting because actually, I'm that's where I struggle in life is just no more than one thing probably. But, yes, because listening to new music was where you relied on. For us, John Peel was the person that you went, right, I'll just listen to John Peel 2 hours a day, or
Mm-hmm.
4 days a week. And you just knew that he was always playing things that were up and coming with the occasional kind of established band, but mostly it was all up and coming stuff. And, it was like, okay, that's some of it was quite painful, but there was always one or two little nuggets of genius in there that you would go away and feel quite happy about. So we don't really have those kind of like gatekeepers anymore that would sort of, curate music so much as it used to be, because it's everyone can be that person now, but you don't know who to trust. There's a lot of distrust in the world now. So going back to the movie then, look, so just tell us, you're doing this crowdfunding, so you need to hit, how much do you need to hit for your equipment?
So we have $5,000 left in our campaign that we need to crowdfund. And I'm not. It's right. We're not running it for profit or anything like that. I being a videographer and or a filmmaker, and being fully independent and everything, I understand like the people who I want to hire. I don't want to have this narrative that you get a lot, which is I'll pay you an exposure. I really want to avoid that narrative. I want to be able to just pay the crew what they're worth, and I'm not keeping any money in my pocket for this project, and I'm definitely going to lose a lot of money on my own, but it's a story worth telling, I think, and will lead to bigger things. But yeah, right now we're just trying to be able to raise funds for some of the necessary interview equipment that we need, like microphones and boom mics and lights and stuff like that. And then also just being able to pay the crew what I think is a fair wage.
And what's for your hopefully the first film? So what will it consist of, and what have you got lined up? Have you got a storyboard?
Yeah, we have a storyboard. So of the three themes that we discussed, it's basically we kind of agreed as a team to not do any public press until the movie is released to say which bands are in it, because we feel that we don't. There's like a level of guilt that I have trying to name larger bands right now for my own public platform, and maybe that's a dynamic I need to get over. But until the music's released, we're not really saying any bands. But we have interviews with 7 bands. 4 of them are local to the Brooklyn scene right now. They're all between the ages of 20 and 30. And then we have interviews with essentially like 3 legends. One of them, funnily enough, owns a coffee shop in my hometown. And then the other 2 were just very big in the 70s and the 80s. And then we're also talking to a couple of journalists who, wrote books on the genre and just are kind of historians. And then also we're featuring some of these like online curators who right now are essentially tastemakers in like the punk scene.
God, this is fascinating.
Yeah. And then I would just say like the last piece on top of the interviews is what we've done a lot of on the street interviews, which we're trying to show the juxtaposition of the public perception of punk versus the people who make the music or consume the music. So at a lot of shows, we've interviewed people asking why they like punk, how do they carry the ethos of the music in their everyday lives? And then we also talk to people who hate punk or, are just indifferent to it and what their perception of it is. And, that's kind of just going to tell the overall story of, what is punk in 2025 in the New York City scene.
Yes. How do you define punk, by the way, now?
That's a fantastic question. And honestly, I should have an answer to this. I don't know, because growing up, to me, being an angsty kid, skateboarding and being kicked out of corporate parks and public spaces and trying to listen to, and just, in my head and with our friends, we were just trying to listen to music and, have fun and just have an outlet for creativity. All of these things always felt very creative, whether it was literally just listening to music or graffitiing or skating. And punk to me used to be somewhat of a anti-authoritarian ethos, where it was to not blindly follow being told what to do because someone is telling you what they think you should do. I don't know if that's a very clear definition of punk. What it means to be punk today, I honestly, I don't know. That's kind of what I'm hoping to answer through this is talking to more people who I would say are the creators of the scene and the current music. I think that they will help me define kind of what I see punk is in 2025.
Yes, it's interesting. Well, it is interesting because the Sex Pistols have reformed, but with a new singer. So, but playing the songs from 1976, 77. So it's kind of interesting how, yes, that all the four members are still alive, but they just don't get on with the lead singer. So, but then, yes, would you call it punk? I don't know. It's a tricky one.
Yeah, exactly. It's yeah, because it's, you know, is punk, you know, I think that forever there was a conversation of is punk a, you know, is punk separate from the music? It's like, yes, you can have these loud thrash like bands, or you can have, you know, like surf rock in San Diego, or you can have, you know, certain things, and it's or ska even. It's like there's a specific sound that I think that you associate it with when you hear punk. But I think more so for people who live it, there's not necessarily a sound associated with it. It's a way of living, and it's kind of, you know, I think punk is unique to other genres in that way, where there's so much more social context to defining what it means than just a particular sound.
And on that cliffhanger, that is the end of the interview. Well, just about, apart from the last little pleasantries. But anyway, massive thank you to Ben for giving me the time for that. Talking about the film that he's going to be making, documentary, Where the Kids Still Scream. So I've put the notes or the links in the notes below of how you can find out more about it to donate money and various other bits and pieces. This has been the C86 Show. David Eastaugh. If you want to contact me, you can on all those social media platform sites. Just do C86 Show. One of them will hit gold. And yes, all these interviews have been archived on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. Check them out if you like indie, 80s indie pop rock and all that malarkey. Anyway, have a great week. Stay safe.